Welcome back to Never Enough Novels. Since we're nearing the end of 2024, I wanted to share a quick recap of my reading year. Today I'm going to go through a bunch of stats that I have about my reading habits, what types of books I was reading, what format, my favorite authors, that sort of thing, as well as cover my favorite books from each genre that I read this year. I actually created my own reading tracking spreadsheet, so I'm going to be looking at that as we go along. It's an Excel file that has a reading log where you can add all of the information about your books, as well as give your books a star rating. And I included half stars because I hate that Goodreads doesn't let you pick half stars. My Excel analysis also has a tab where it has a bunch of charts and graphs and statistics about what type of books I read, the formats, etc. So I'm excited to kind of go through these stats for the first time and share them with you. If you're interested in a different way to track your reading and you like the idea of having an Excel spreadsheet like this, I do sell this on my blog for $5. So I'll put the link to the 2025 version down in the comments below. So if you're interested, you can grab it for yourself. Kicking things off is the first and most obvious stat, which is the number of books that I read this year. As of today, which is December 22nd, I've read 155 books, so I know that I'm going to hit at least then 160 by the end of the year. I currently have 3 books going that I'm almost finished with, and I know over the next week, especially with it being break, I'll be able to get through a few more. So that's going to put me at like over 160 for the year, which is the most books that I've read in one year by far for a while, so I'm pretty excited about that number. Looking at how that actually happened, January was by far the month where I read the most books. I had 23 books in that month alone, so I definitely got the year off to a good start. And ironically, December so far is going to be my lowest month of the year. I feel like with everything else going on and getting ready for Christmas, it's just harder to find time to read. So we'll see though by the end of the month how many books I can add on to that number. In terms of the format of books, I was actually kind of surprised that the highest amount by format was 30% for ebooks, and then that is closely followed by 29% for audiobooks. I also do separate hardcover and paperback for some reason. So hardcover was 16% and paperback was 25%. So when you add those two together, that gets you what? 41%. So I guess overall, like physical books were the highest category at 41%, but it's pretty closely followed by ebooks and audiobooks. So I was kind of surprised that they were actually so evenly split among the different formats. If I am reading an audiobook or an ebook, it is almost 100% of the time from my library because I use Hoopla and Libby just so much throughout the year. So it's good to know that a big chunk of my reading time comes from library resources. Then let's take a look at the books I read by genre. This one is just pretty funny to me because romance is far and away the highest number. Out of the 155 books that I have logged on my spreadsheet so far, 97 of them came from the romance genre. So we're talking about 2/3 of the books that I read this year were from the romance genre. The next highest was thriller. If you combine that with like thriller/mysteries, that was 35 books. So that's probably what, like a fifth of the books that I read. And then fantasy would be the next one with 15. And then there's kind of a couple other genres mixed in there. But I mean, it's not, I guess, a huge surprise, but I didn't realize that so many of my books were romance this year. I was trying to add more mysteries and thrillers, so I think that number went up even since last year, but still, what can I say? I love romance and happy ever afters the most. Another interesting stat I have in here is the number of female versus male authors that I read. So female made up 91% of the books that I read, and male was only 9%. I guess that's not a huge surprise since it seems like most of the romance authors are females, but I would have thought there were more like thrillers or mysteries or fantasies from male authors as well. So let's dig into that a little further because I'm curious which male authors were the ones that I actually read since there weren't too many of them. So I'm going to sort my tracking log by the male authors so I can see which ones those were. Okay, so it looks like Riley Sager was the most, kind of by far. I've been working my way through his backlist this year because I really enjoyed, I think last year was the first year I read anything by Riley Sager, and I just love his writing and plot twists, so I was really trying to work through more of his books this past year, and he consistently has highly rated books on my tracker as well, so I highly recommend him as a thriller author if you're looking for someone new. Peter Swenson also shows up a couple of times, one Brandon Sanderson as a fantasy, and then I'm currently reading Somewhere Beyond the Sea by TJ Klune, so that's another fantasy that's by a male author as well. I also have Jason Rekulak, who I just discovered kind of recently as well. He has 2 thriller books out so far, Hidden Pictures and The Last One at the Wedding, and I really enjoyed both of those. So the male authors that I do have on my list are highly rated, mostly in like the mystery or thriller genre, but I do love them and I'm looking forward to reading even more next year. Speaking of star ratings, let's see some of my highest rated and lowest rated books. So if I sort by lowest to highest, so I gave one book a 2-star rating. It's the lowest rating on my list. That was Kilt Trip. I can't remember the author. I actually didn't write it down and I should have. And I was so excited about this book. I love the cover. It's like a romance set in Scotland. And probably part of the reason I gave it such a low rating is because I thought it was going to be a lot better than it was. It's kind of like just a generic romance about a girl who travels to Scotland and she helps a company with their like local tours and she clashes with like the owner's son and there's all sorts of like tension between them. But I think I was just expecting, it just felt like a very generic romance, like a lot of trite sayings and cliches and just definitely didn't kind of live up to the expectations that I have. So that was my lowest rating at 2 stars. The other couple of books I had, so a couple 2.5. Let's see how many 5-star ratings I gave out. I know I can sometimes be a little heavy-handed with those and probably rate things a little too high, but all right, out of the 155 books I have logged, I had 26 that I gave a 5-star rating. So let's see, that's 26 divided by 155. Okay, so about 17% that I gave an absolute 5-star rating. Like I said, I do use half stars, so there are plenty more out there that got 4.5 stars. Let's see if I add those in as well, that number's probably going to go up a lot higher. I like to use that 4.5-star rating for a lot of things. Okay, so yeah, the count is at 54 books that I gave 4.5 or 5 stars, meaning that a third of the books that I read I rated like 4.5 stars or higher. So you can definitely tell. I'm sure not all of those actually deserve to be that high, but I have a tendency to like finish a book and be like, I just loved it so much, and give it a high star rating. That's kind of funny. Or, I mean, I've just read a lot of really high quality books and authors. I guess you could look at it that way as well. I know overall this year it felt like I read a lot of really good books and I was always excited to talk about them or recommend them to people. So I guess that kind of tracks. But it is a little funny to see that I was definitely generous with my 4.5 and 5-star ratings. Okay, next I promised I would give my favorite books by genre. So let's go through those really quick. Obviously, we have to start with romance since that's my most read genre. And my favorite book of the year, I decided, was one that I just read very recently. It's called Is She Really Going Out With Him by Sophie Cousins. I don't know if there's any sort of recency bias there because it's one of the ones that I recently read and kind of remember the most. But I finished this book and I was just like, oh, this was perfection. Everything about it was absolutely wonderful. It is a romance, so there is a love story, but it is also an excellent read about a mom who just recently went through a divorce and is kind of dealing with managing her children and her job and her love life. And it just felt so relatable and perfectly written. And I was also laughing out loud through the entire book. This is a heartfelt romance that you will fall in love with, and it will also have you laughing so often. And honestly, like that's what I'm looking for in a book. So it just fit the bill with absolutely everything that I want out of a romance book. Like I said, the basic premise is that we have a mom who is a writer for a column and she kind of has her job threatened by this company that's taking over her publication. So she's encouraged to kind of change things up with her column, make it more personal and more exciting. So she comes up with this idea to have her children pick out dates for her. So rather than kind of going the normal boring online route, she will work with her children to come up with dates in real life. So it has to be people that they met or that they know of. So her children pick her dates for her. At the same time, a newish colleague agrees to kind of a parallel column that they'll both write at the same time. She hates his guts. He's like the epitome of just like a charming, gets his way, everybody loves him type person, and she just is really annoyed with his whole personality and extra annoyed to find out that he's now going to be writing a parallel column and potentially could take over her job at some point. But as the two of them go through their dating adventures together, you know, they find out that they have more in common than they realize. Sparks are flying, things get steamy, but he is a lot younger than her and she has all of this other stuff in her life that she's dealing with, so it's kind of not the right time, maybe not the right decision for her. But ultimately, this book shows how love can find a way, and sometimes the choices that we make are actually the best for everyone. I loved how it showed a mother balancing the needs of her children and being a mom with also just being a woman and finding love. Plus, throughout the book, like each of the chapter headings are her recent Google searches, which was honestly one of my favorite parts of the book. They were so funny and so relatable. Definitely things I have found myself Googling in the past, including but not limited to things about Paul Hollywood, him kneading bread, Paul Hollywood's eyes, like just absolutely incredibly funny stuff in there. So out of all the books, that's one of the ones that I recommend the most, but it will be my favorite book from the romance genre, easily by far. Next up, let's look at thrillers, since I was trying to read more thrillers and mysteries this year. My favorite is going to be Worst Case Scenario by T.J. Newman. I adore this author. Every single book that I've read of hers has been given 5 stars, and it's easily one of my favorites of the year. So this year's book, called Worst Case Scenario, is about a pilot that has a heart attack, and the plane crashes into a nuclear power plant. The book shows all of the ramifications of this incident through the eyes of the various people involved, whether that's folks at the power plant or those who have been called in to help, emergency personnel dealing with the fallout in the rest of the town, as well as like the mothers and sons, daughters of the people that are involved and how it affects their families also. This was so incredibly captivating. I read it in 24 hours. I was like sobbing by the end. I just couldn't fathom kind of what the long-term effects of this sort of disaster were. And I felt like I learned a lot about how nuclear power works and the threat that it poses if something goes wrong. So that aspect, like the scientific aspect, was extremely interesting by itself. But when you add in the thriller and like the intensity of trying to make decisions, trying to solve problems with a very limited amount of time, this book was just mind-blowing and absolutely incredible. Then moving on to fantasy, my favorite book from that genre, I actually didn't read, like I said, too many of these, but mine was Heartless Hunter by Kristen Ciccarelli. This one, actually, I don't know if it actually came out in 2024 or not, but the second one's coming out in early January of next year, so maybe it did. But this is I don't know if it was technically classified as like young adult fantasy. It kind of walked the line between like young adult and adult fantasy, but it's more in like the romantasy genre because there's definitely a love story involved as well. But it takes place in this world where there's witches and witch hunters. So witches are basically not allowed to exist, and there is a whole group of witch hunters whose main job is to hunt them down and get rid of them. So our main character, Rune, is a witch herself, and she's kind of a vigilante who works at night to help save the rest of her kind. During the day, she poses as like a ditzy socialite who is supposed to be like, who hates witches and everything to do with them, but she runs in the circles of the people and government officials who know what's happening. So she has a chance to kind of flirt with and maybe get to know better Gideon, who is one of the most ruthless witch hunters out there. And Gideon knows that there's something off about Rune, that she's probably more than what she seems to be. So both of them are kind of playing this cat and mouse game where they know that they need to get more information from the other, but there's also intense feelings developing. And this is part of a duology. So like I said, the second book comes out, I think in January of 2025. I love that this fantasy series is just a duology because it seems like so many these days end up with like 5, 6, or 7 books, and the quality doesn't always stay the same as you get that far into a series. So I think it's really interesting that this is more than just a standalone, so you get, more world building and get to know the characters better and more things happen, but it's contained within just like these 2 books and then you're done. The last one I'm going to share is my favorite nonfiction book. It is the only nonfiction book that I read this year, but it was also my favorite book of the entire year. So if you get a chance, you can check out my top 10 books of 2024. Spoiler, you will find this book at the #1 spot. It is called Nuclear War by Annie Jacobsen. If you notice, there's like a nuclear theme to my favorite books this year. For some reason, I am all in on finding out more about how nuclear power plants, nuclear weapons work. I think it's just incredibly fascinating, and the authors that I've read about it have done an amazing job like explaining it and sharing how impactful these things can be. So in Nuclear War, Annie Jacobsen walks us through a scenario where North Korea fires a nuclear weapon at the United States. From the moment that we detect that there's a nuclear weapon aimed toward our country, she takes us through literally like second by second and minute by minute what would happen following that. And along the way, she explains how nuclear weapons have been developed, the history of them, what our current like policies and procedures are related to them. So we get top secret information, sometimes from very high up government officials that she has interviewed and researched, as well as scientists involved with these nuclear programs, all coming together to tell this incredibly fascinating story about what happens in this scenario and how devastating it can be for humanity. This felt like I was reading a thriller because of the way that she wrote the story and told us the scenario and walked us through all the different steps that could happen and the unimaginable implications of a nuclear weapon actually hitting our country and the fallout for the rest of the world. So I feel like it's one of those books that's just incredibly important for people to read, just to understand kind of the status of our nuclear weapons and our relationships with other countries that also have them, as well as our current safeguards in place, of which there are not as many as you would think, and our ability to detect nuclear missiles that are sent to us, as well as the Russians' ability to detect missiles, which isn't great either. So there was just so many interesting tidbits in this book that I felt I never would have known otherwise, and now just have a better understanding in general of how this situation works. And like I said, it's a topic that I'm now immensely interested in, so I'm excited to kind of read more about it, as well as just the history of nuclear weapons around the world in general. But I think this would make a great gift for people who love nonfiction. It's classified as the narrative nonfiction type writing style, so they're basically talking about true events, but writing them in a way that feels more of novel. So it's very accessible to people even like me who don't normally read nonfiction. Overall, it was just incredibly well written, well researched, and one of those books that I will be recommending to everyone for years to come. So that was just kind of a fun recap of my reading year. I am excited to see what 2025 brings. Coming up soon will be a video of my most anticipated reads of 2025. There are already tons of the books out there that I cannot wait to get into next year, and I'm excited to share them with you as well. Let me know in the comments a little bit about your reading year. What was your favorite book that you read so far this year? How many books did you read? Are there any books that you're looking forward to reading next year? I always love to hear more about fellow readers' reading lives as well. And make sure you hit like on this video and subscribe to my channel to see even more bookish content in 2025.